Okay. Hi, I'm Shock Exchange, and this is Trump and the GE, where we discuss the president's policies and how they affect the economy and the community. I have with me, of course, Torian Mitchell. And before we get started, we'd like people to subscribe to the channel, like the videos, and share the videos. We know people are interacting with the videos, but we like to get this information out to as many people as possible, if you would. Um, so we haven't done one on the economy in a while. Last one we did was about uh, Jerome Powell, how the Fed was spiking Jerome Powell's assets, and spiking of
Yeah.
assets goes on incessantly even after the pandemic or amid the pandemic. So that's why you saw the Dow rise from 18,000 to as much as it's doubled to like 36,000, and it's been a combination of the economy coming out of the pandemic and the fight and the Fed spiking assets. But when you have all this ebulliency that goes from almost like ground zero and then it goes at warp speed, that's what you get, rising prices. I didn't think there was a pathway. I wasn't sure there was a pathway to reopening the economy. So Pfizer and Moderna with these vaccines, it's almost a miracle because as soon as they came out with these vaccines that help, you know, prevent the coronavirus, and then you had remdesivir and treatments from Merck and Gilead to treat people once they became hospitalized. It was just almost like a miracle. So now the economy is reopened, but now prices are spiking, and so it's hitting everybody hard. And this one thing I was always afraid of, even after the financial crisis, that if you print money and give it to corporations, and you don't, and the consumer doesn't rebound, the consumer is always vulnerable. That means that it's vulnerable to another recession, or vulnerable to spiking prices or inflation. So inflation hits everybody equally, and that's the point, that poor people can't avoid it. In terms of rising grocery prices, gasoline prices, so on and so forth. So I'm looking at personal consumption expenditures throughout. Since the financial crisis, the Federal Reserve has been keen on sparing what they call personal consumption expenditures, or PCE, excluding rent and gasoline and energy, food and energy, food and energy. They're
Hmm.
trying to get it to like 2%, and they had a hard time doing it. So that always justified why they could keep quantitative easing going. The
Hmm.
quantitative easing and low interest rates were driving the stock market, but they justified it because they couldn't get PCE up to 2% or higher. Now that problem's been solved because PCE was 4.4% in September, 4.2% in August, 4.2% in July, and 4% in June. So now they have the opposite problem. They're trying to slow it down. So
Right.
and this is a little too fast for the Fed's liking, and it's hitting everybody equally, including poor people. So I'll let Mr. Mitchell weigh in just on the overall uh, inflation, how the Fed measures it.
Yeah. I mean, one, I wish I guess, had a little bit better news since the last time we chatted about the economy. I feel like every time we talk about the economy, especially this past 12 months, I feel like I'm almost just a parrot of myself, just, kind of repeating the same things because these patterns just continue, almost unabated, despite how terrible the policies and the effects of said policy has been. But to take a step back, I like to speak to the folks that may watch and kind of hear these terms, and especially if you're looking at corporate media, and often they're talking about these concepts and terms that 30,000 foot view in the air, and it just doesn't touch or kind of seep into a very practical sense, right? Like, what does this mean for me and my family, right? So pretty much, what is inflation and kind of where does it come from, right? So we have to First look at, well, money supply. That's really what we are talking about when we talk about inflation, right? The cost of goods and services. What it used to cost to build a car 10 years ago differs from what it may cost today. The cost of making our food, making our homes, manufacturing things, and even providing certain services. And, as you mentioned before, and as we've, been noting over the past 12 months, that when you look at essentially that basket of goods, which we measure it by looking at what's known as the CPI or Consumer Price Index, usually that Consumer Price Index stays typically between like 2%, 2.5% on the higher end, which should note that this is the increase. So if your bread was $1 last year, 2% inflation would say, okay, we're going to tack on 2 cents to that dollar, and now I'm paying $1.02. But where does that come from, right? Like where, it just seems like arbitrary, right? Like, so ultimately where it comes from is the Federal Reserve, and specifically the Fed fund rate. So the internal rate at which commercial banks like, B of A, Capital One, TD, Wells Fargo, most of the household banking names that most people are familiar with, well, they borrow money. They borrow money from each other, and they borrow money from the Fed. And just like when any other consumer walks into a bank, tries to get a loan, whether it's for a mortgage, whether it's for a business, they're going to charge you an interest rate because that's how they make money on the money that they give you, right? So the Federal Reserve does the same thing. And then the commercial banks, when they borrow from each other, also do the same thing. But obviously, the rates at which they lend the money to each other are going to be hyper favorable, right? So typically a Fed fund rate will go between 0%, which means no interest, or virtually interest free, to about 0.10 kind of basis points. So to keep it very, very low, in other words, and the reason being that they want to keep it very low is, well, at least according to Econ 101, so that when they in turn charge you an interest rate, that interest rate is going to include the interest that they have paid on that money. So when you go into the bank and, 1 year, like, oh, wow, this mortgage, the interest on the mortgage is now 3% as opposed to the 4% that it was a year prior. Well, the way they were able to lower that rate is because they got a lower interest rate from either the Federal Reserve or another commercial bank. And the reverse happens as well when the Federal Reserve or the commercial banks are increasing the federal fund rate or the interest rate on that money. They in turn charge you more interest. So let's take an example of a business owner. You're a business owner, small business owner. You got an ice cream shop. You're selling the world's best ice cream. And everyone's a fan. Well, let's say you took out $100,000, business loan, at 6% interest. And over the next, 20 years, you're going to pay back pretty much a mortgage, at 6%. Well, in order for you to determine, well, how much should I charge? What can I afford to pay my staff? What can I afford to pay for my supplies, my vendors, to be able to service the customers? You're already $100K in debt, because that's $100K debt on your books, but you also have $100K cash, but you also have your interest rate. All right, so it's $100K plus the 6%. And that's what's going to determine your prices. That's what's going to determine how much you can pay. Even yourself as the business owner, as many small business owners will tell you, they go years without paying themselves. Why? Because interest rates. But they'll pay the staff. They'll try to buy the goods and the machinery that they need to keep their shops open in order to service the customers so that they know how many customers they need in order to get to what's known as a break-even point, and certainly to get to profitability. So that ice cream may have started off at $1 or wanted to start off at $1, but after taking out 100K at a 6% interest rate, realized, hey, I can't offer this thing at $1. I got to offer this thing at $1.30. And now they offer one scoop at $1.30. Well, this is why we watch inflation and essentially the increased cost of goods. When we go to the grocery store, when we go to the gas station, when we're paying rent, when we're going for a mortgage, when we're refinancing, essentially anything that touches money, and we're borrowing that money at an increased cost, that's where it's coming from. It's coming from the bank and specifically the Federal Reserve. So there's really, I think a kind of short, very Reader's Digest version of inflation. So when we talk about, well, where does it come from? Right now, kind of going back to what's been happening for the last 13 years with, and why, we stand firm on that square that it's been terrible policy by the Federal Reserve, through quantitative easing, but the quantitative easing has simply been a blank check. They've been spending billions of dollars every single month. And let's be very clear that, well, where does this money come from, right? It comes out of thin air. Treasury, right? Like the Treasury prints off the actual money, but the Federal Reserve is the one that charges the interest for every dollar that is created. And yes, that dollar is kind of created out of thin air, that piece of paper. But the debt that's attached to it is given over to the American taxpayer. So every time you pay your taxes, you are paying out the debt that the Federal Reserve has attached to you. So in other words, when you're handing out billions of dollars every single month for the last 12 years to corporations, to hedge funds, to the investor class, but you have not passed out that same cash flow to the bulk, like the 95% of taxpayers that have contributed to paying the debt, then you're going to get this uneven balance in the economy. And that's what we are subject to now. Fast forward to today, CPI is over 6%. We are, kind of speculating right around Christmas, right before the new year, hitting 7%. Why does that sound crazy, or why does that not sound crazy to others that may not understand that? When you're looking at targeting a 2% rise in inflation, in cost of goods and services, and you're looking at that being tripled and past triple plus some in such a short period of time, that means that we are on our way to potentially hyperinflation. And what the heck is hyperinflation? Examples of hyperinflation, kind of traditional examples: Zimbabwe, World War II Germany, under Hitler, and even Venezuela currently, even Nigeria currently experiencing hyperinflation. So what is hyperinflation? Hyperinflation is the exact opposite, where the Fed fund rate increases, but it also increases the money supply so fast. So in a very real example, you go in and get flour. Flour might be $3 a pound. Monday, you go in by Wednesday, and that same $3 a pound is now $300 a pound. And like, whoa, how did we go from, $3 a pound for flour to $300 for flour? And now you're starting to see money printed in exorbitant amounts, and also the denominations themselves are significantly large, right? Like you could walk around with literally $1 million bank note, but the purchasing power of that $1 million bank note may be $2. So that means essentially the economy has flipped upside down. And when you are seeing inflation increase that rapidly in such a short amount of time, that's the danger, is that we are on our way to a Venezuela, to a Zimbabwe, to a World War II Germany economically, and looking at hyperinflation. And unfortunately, and this is my position, that we have essentially created a situation where the Federal Reserve has handed out money to their friends, to political friends, to corporate friends, to investment management friends, and essentially the investor class, where to the point where they have kept inflation at nearly zero. So what does that mean over the last 12 years? And now we're coming out of a pandemic. Markets are opening up. Economies globally are opening up. Borders are opening up. And now you have the highest number of labor force that's quit in just the last 2 months. I believe over 4 million workers have quit out of the labor force. So the labor force is in the middle of a revolt and a dropout, along with which is going to cause a shortage, which means that a buildup of supply. So in other words, all of these factors that's impacting the real cost of goods and services, along with the fact that the Federal Reserve has been highly selective about where they're placing the money, as opposed to putting it in people's hands in order to have liquidity within the real economy, not just the stock market, not just housing, but the real economy in every class, from poor all the way up to upper middle class. Instead of putting it in those people's hands and putting it in a select few hands, well, you've created this massive gap that has now left the economy completely vulnerable. And now you're in a position to where we actually are dependent on quantitative easing continuing. Because it's only been since July that the Fed has announced they're cutting off quantitative easing. Each month they've already started essentially weaning off of their repo purchase program. And we're looking at inflation touching 7%. And we're not even, it's not 6 months yet. We're not even out 6 months. And we're already near 7% inflation. So to me, that's a clear sign that you've kept the economy so weak for the last 12 years. And now you're pulling the rug on the terrible solution, but it was a solution nonetheless. And you're taking away the solution when the economy, ironically, is at its weakest. So, in other words, we have to go a little bit longer. And instead of the solution, to me, instead of putting it simply into the investor class, how about putting it into the actual American taxpayers' pockets so that distribution can flow throughout the rest of the country more evenly? Do that for a few years, and then essentially look at the economic tests to see, are we in a place where quantitative easing can now be reduced and the economy is in a much more healthy place, and it will not have this shock effect of shocking the economy into potential hyperinflation state.
Okay. But as far as the scary part is that, this economic downturn well, during the financial crisis, it affected the financial class, or the investor class. So now you get a reset where you basically bail out the investor class, and political friends and so on and so forth. So the next recession won't affect them. So it doesn't affect the powers that be. It doesn't affect. Apparently, there's somebody's been given favor status in this country. Wall Street, the investor class, certain political friends. If it doesn't affect them, will the government react? That's the question. Only time they react is when it affects their donors, or somebody they want to work for and leave office, or somebody they want to sleep with. And so if it doesn't affect them, so this when we talk about inflation, it doesn't affect people who own all the assets. It doesn't affect them because the stock market never falls regardless of what the Fed does.
It surely doesn't seem that way, does it? Like ever since
you expect the Dow to fall to like 28,000 or something,
and it's gone up to
36,000. But from a high level, when you look at how inflation affects your purchasing power, if you buy a basket of goods every month, and those basket of goods go from X to 2X, that means that your purchasing power, your income you get from your job, is worth half of what it was worth before inflation, and it's eating into people's pocketbooks, and they can't avoid it. Especially some of these things that we call elastic goods, things that you have to have. As far as the pandemic is concerned, that you have rising costs, but you also have, I guess, supply chain issues where, let's say, some of the retailers that I followed, like Macy's, American Eagle, Abercrombie and Fitch, Urban Outfitters, they had inventory, not American Eagle, but other companies had inventory that was building up over the holidays. Then the pandemic hit in like February, March of 2020, and now you had these retail all this inventory they couldn't sell because demand just fell to the floor. So they had stale inventory, cash flows drying up. They had to go out and borrow money to make up for the cash flow shortfall, and the government allowed them to borrow money at low rates and tap into the debt market, even though some of them weren't credit worthy. But so you have the inventory that's built up, demand's falling to the floor. So you try to get the inventory off your books. Then guess what? Pfizer and Moderna come up with a vaccine, and we come out of the pandemic, and the government spiking, assets, and people feel more wealthy because the stock market is going up, and the economy is reopening. Now demand goes up, and you don't have an inventory.
Right.
So it creates these supply chain issues. That's what we saw with the computer chip industry, Micron, these companies, Intel,
right,
having supply chain issues. They couldn't get product because nobody was producing them. Who knew that that we would come out of the pandemic like that? And so you had demand, but no inventory, no supply, and it causes prices to go up. You had demand going through the roof and supply going down. You have to pay a higher price to get those supplies. So that's one of the reasons that costs are going up, because of supply chain issues. And there's a lot of talk about the supply chain issues out in the San Francisco Bay, out in the Bay Area, where you have these cargo ships just circling the bay.
Right.
And imports have been sent here from China, but there could be demand. Some example, there may be not enough demand, but it also could be demand. But can you get these supplies to the consumer, because the port has been clogged up?
Yeah, they're at a. I was just going to quickly say that they're at a point where they're charging the ports. I believe, including LA port, which is responsible for about 70% of the country's goods that come in from the West Coast. So they're charging the container holders, effectively corporations. I believe $1,000 going to start. I believe they started November 1st. $1,000 a day. Either $100 a day or $1,000 a day.
You're talking about per container, though, right?
Right, per container. In order to, incentivize these corporations to get off their butts and start moving these containers, aka moving the products, because it's causing such a backlog. So, in some ways, it's also a false, a false both demand and supply issue, because when it becomes more challenging to measure the demand, right? If the supply is, if the response is that, well, the supply is low, right? But if the supply isn't low, if you're falsely capping the supply to say, well, oh, it's because of these logistical issues, but it's just you withholding that,
Right.
withholding the supply. So obviously the demand is kind of backing up, but that's simply a lack of response to the existing demand, not necessarily that the demand is increasing, if that makes sense.
I understand. Yeah, right. You're
So yeah,
describing
it becomes harder to
you're
measure
describing
the
greed.
demand.
That's called greed, right?
It is pretty much. It was just a nuanced way of saying mofos is greedy, right?
Right.
So, even in the pandemic.
Right. This is a 1 in 100 year event where you can have the ship circle the bay, and then you can you know demand higher prices for whatever you're selling, and the prices don't have to make sense. It's because we're coming out of the pandemic, or we're having supply chain issues.
Yep.
Some of it's supply chain issues, but it's going to drive up prices 300, 400%. And the longer you wait in the bay, the more money you can demand. So we'll
Yeah.
see if they all of a sudden these supply chain issues start going away once they start getting fine. And we talked about this, I call the Bill Cartwright effect. Bill Cartwright, when he was real clumsy when he first came to the league and throwing the elbows all over the place. And when he grabbed a rebound, his elbows would be flailing around and people just bailing out of the way. And he was always hurting people. I was accidentally hurting people, and it became a thing where you didn't want to get hit by one of his elbows. He was so clumsy, he couldn't get out of his own way. You didn't know if he was going to hurt himself or hurt you, and blah 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 blah. Then one night he hurt Hakeem Olajuwon. Olajuwon's just standing there. He just flails the elbow, hits him in the eye, and you're like, oh my god, because Olajuwon was a star. He's like maybe his third year in the league. He was a burgeoning star,
Mm-hmm.
and he had to leave.
Franchise
He was
player.
out for several. He was out for several games, and he came back with goggles. He had to wear goggles for a while. The NBA told Bill Cartwright, "That's money. That's why the NBA is losing." Because when Olajuwon was in the lineup, the home games were always sold out. All the Houston games were always sold out, home and away. And they told Bill Cartwright, every time you hurt somebody, we're going to find you. And all of a sudden, the injury stopped. The accidents just miraculously stopped.
Magically disappeared.
He didn't hurt anybody else anymore. And so, yeah, once you start finding these cargo ships, you're going to find out that these supply chain issues are going to clear up pretty quickly. But we know they're price gouging. I a couple of weeks ago, I had to buy some forms for something I was doing. In the past, I bought these forms, let's say for $20 for a pack. Now they're like $50 for a pack.
Wow.
I went to buy them a couple of weeks ago, and they didn't have them in stock. They had them per sheet. I had to buy 4 sheets for $20.
Wow.
Now I'm sure there's some supply chain issues and whatever, but that's price gouging. And I had to have them, so I just paid it and kept it moving. But that's price gouging, and we saw this with the first time we saw it. We noticed this with Pfizer, when Pfizer and had to have these cold storage machines because their vaccines had to be shipped at 94 degrees below Fahrenheit. All of a sudden, the demand for these cold storage machines started going up, and then the prices started doubling and tripling. And then all of a sudden, they didn't have any supply.
Yep.
So it was price gouging. So 1 in 100 year event where you have Pfizer and Moderna who needs these cold storage refrigerators, these cold storage machines, and this amount of them.
Right.
You need, lots of them. You never had the type of demand in your life after this pandemic ends, and they were price gouging. And so you have the same effect where people are hiking prices for these business forms that are needed for product being sold out in the bay, and also for cold storage machines, computer chips, what have you. That's driving this spiraling inflation that seems to be going out of control. And the we can measure demand, we can measure supply per se, but how can you measure the cost of supply chain issues? And I guess we'll soon find
Right.
out once they start finding these companies who these cargo ships out in the bay. We'll find out if these supply chain issues can clear up faster than we thought. And we also know they're price gouging for oil. Brent oil is at $86 a barrel.
Yeah.
It's up.
Yep.
It's crazy because it was almost like it's $10 a barrel during the pandemic, and Trump tried to get. He actually got OPEC to cut supply to help drive the prices up to help the oil companies here, but they're making all kinds of excuses. For instance, in the UK, a lot of demand for oil because UK had spent a lot of time and energy on alternative energy
Yep.
like wind power, and then finding out what happens when these windmills don't blow or the wind
Right.
doesn't blow. It's hard to generate any. With season, my grandfather behind, like,
Right.
the first thing I ask, what happens when the wind doesn't blow?
Right.
And so now they're trying to now the demand is shifting from alternative energy back to oil, and it's saying that's what's driving the oil prices up. But these price people are gouging,
Oh, it is,
gouging.
and
Right?
to your example too, about the cold storage units, much like the Cartwright effect, when hospitals and other facilities were essentially saying, "Listen, we don't have the budget for these things," and I'm sure Pfizer was already counting their money, rolling around in it before it actually got there, because they're using an accrual-based accounting system instead of a cash-based system. All of a
Would you call it
sudden,
hustle math? What do you call it? Hustle math?
exactly, hustle man. So all of a sudden, it no longer needed to be stored at 94 degrees below zero.
94 and a half, 94.5. That's very exact.
94. And it couldn't even be a degree off. It's like for every degree off, it degraded its life about like 2 weeks, the vaccine's life.
Right.
So all of a sudden, it magically was able to be stored at 32 degrees. It's like the depths at which people, we saw this with the airlines, we saw this with Amazon. It got to a point where Amazon stepped in, and I'm sure folks will remember at the very beginning of the pandemic, right before the summer, you had hand sanitizer, alcohol. We were no different. We bought online because alcohol was out. We bought online like 90. It was a 2-gallon jug of 90% rubbing alcohol, and we paid $100 for this thing. $100. And it was just like, well, what choice do we have? It's like,
Right.
we gotta
Exactly.
do
You
it.
need it, you need it, right?
You're right. And, thankfully we're still using it to this day.
I bet,
So I guess
the alcohol gonna last a long time, right?
I guess we got our money's worth.
Right.
But the point is, this is the type of price gouging. And, Amazon finally stepped in, because you had these sellers that were hoarding. Folks caught, the news clippings and the videos that were circulating social media, of, people that, had the state AG stepping in, bringing in the marshals, cracking open U-Haul storages and finding, floor to ceiling hand sanitizers and baby wipes, and essentially forcing them to eat the cost. And what was pretty interesting about that with the price gouging, I think that there was a collective resound coming from the populace, that this is pure price gouging. This is taking advantage of people. And I kind of chuckled to myself, and I said, "Oh, but I thought America didn't like socialism." I thought,
Right.
yeah, I was like, y'all told me Since Hoover.
That was that was service. You just say that.
I
You just say
thought
that.
everybody was a capitalist. I was like,
You just say that in order to pass civics class, right?
right.
You put that on your that
I was like, like all of a sudden, the hyper capitalist is all of a sudden demonized and put in handcuffs. Some of these people were literally put in handcuffs, put in jail, had court dates.
right. But
Because
did anybody check? Did anybody check where the stagees were hoarding sanitizers?
Well, this is. Well, that too, right?
Who's gonna watch the regular? Who's gonna regulate the regulators? Right.
It's like, but no, I just thought it was really interesting. Yet there was not that same resounding effect. It was, just kind of looking at the vitriol that was had, because effectively these people represented the mom and pop shop, right? These were not the Jeff Bezos, the Elon Musk, the GE Capitals. It was, John and Jim, saw an opportunity, shelled out, 10, 15K of their life savings and, jacked up prices 300%. They did the same thing Martin Shkreli did when they,
Right.
when he got ownership of the patents, jacked up the price 3,000%. And his argument was, well, are we not in America? That's pretty much what his argument was. We are a capitalist society. I'm a capitalist. I'm going to do what capitalists do. And yet, for these individuals, even like a Martin Shkreli, and not that I'm defending Martin Shkreli, but I am pointing out the kind of cognitive dissonance between the vitriol that was had for the Martin Shkrelis and these essentially individuals. Yet there's almost no smoke. Where was Amazon's crackdown on Amazon? Where was Amazon's crackdown? Because Amazon has been price gouging for years. They've been putting independent bookstores. They've been putting authors. They've been putting independent manufacturers out of business for the better part of a decade. Where's the crackdown on Amazon? Where's the crackdown on these large corporations, in other words? And where's the vitriol? Much the same that these individuals got. So even within the population, in other words, there's this very uneven response. And hence, even the uneven response when it comes to monetary policy, that's having a direct impact on inflation. That's having a direct impact on cost of living. How is it that there is not more vitriol for Federal Reserve chairman that effectively front ran? And all of a sudden, the SEC has to act like the rules must specifically name Federal Reserve employees. Like to say, oh, well, front running is illegal. And not only is it unethical, it's just clearly illegal. Unless you're a Federal Reserve chairman, well, then we got to take a step back and rewrite the policy so that it says specifically Federal Reserve chairmen are not allowed to front run stocks. It's like, how do you?
Other thing we never really been in this position before. I don't remember what Fed is actually buying stocks.
I mean, but
calling it good for the economy. I got what you're saying. I mean,
it's like even still. How do you?
Martin Shkreli,
vitriol for that? Like, where are the pitchforks? And to me, as gross as what Martin Shkreli was doing, there is precedent for what he was doing. You don't have to like it, but at the same time, if you want to stand on this square of capitalism and say, well, America's a capitalist country and dot, 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 Well, it can't be only capitalist until you don't like it. When that
Well,
capitalism
the other
works against you. But then when you have the people that actually control money supply and monetary policy that's impacting, like to me, that's even more gross. Because what Martin Shkreli did was kind of in a silo. Whereas what the Federal Reserve does impacts the entire country, every
well,
man,
the other
woman, and child. And there should be way more pitchforks for Jerome Powell, for the Federal Reserve. In other words, the vitriol should be significantly higher for the folks that are doing the real damage versus.
well the other
Go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, the other thing is that the reality is that you know this and I know this, but how many people can understand what the Federal Reserve? How many individuals can understand what the Federal Reserve is doing, or even care? A lot of times they don't even know how the typical person doesn't know how that affects his or her bottom line, his or her personal existence. But they definitely understand what Martin Shkreli was doing, because when you corner the market on these drugs and that come off patent, and then you spike the price, they know when their drug prices are going through the roof and they can't afford drugs. And the same thing, Valiant was doing, which is now called Bausch Health, a couple other companies, and they were complaining to the policymakers, "Why the prices? I've been buying this drug for 20 years.
Right.
Why is it going up to the point where I can't afford it?" And Mallinckrodt was raising the price of Actar to the
Yeah.
point where it was unaffordable,
Right.
just to afford, just to be able to justify or service debt that they ran up for the acquisition of Questor. So it seemed like the policymakers have figured out, consumers understand what Mallinckrodt was doing, Martin Shkreli was doing, and what Bausch Health was doing, but they don't really understand what Jerome Powell was doing. You and I understand what they were doing.
Right.
The typical consumer doesn't understand it. And what Martin Shkreli was doing, it could be considered to have gone what they call beyond the pale. Well, they told him, knock it off. Because he
Right.
hiked the
Right.
price of this product that nobody could afford it. They told him.
Right.
Next thing you know, he's in jail for something else. Something happened back in high school or something.
Right.
Something he did back in high school. But Hillary Clinton, those people, they're gangster. They
Now,
told him. And
do
then,
do you have
next thing
to
you know, he's in
form?
jail for...
Do you have to give the Federal Reserve a warning though? Like, do you have to
No,
treat?
you don't. You don't.
You know what I
You
mean?
don't.
Like,
It's gotten to the point now.
so-
It's gotten to the point now where they're incorrigible. The Federal Reserve is incorrigible,
right.
and these the investor class is incorrigible, and they can't even stop. So I told you about the guy who on the Richmond Federal Reserve chairman
Right.
who was giving information to his client to consultants who then get information to Wall Street firms about what the Fed was going to do in terms of its policy, weeks or days in advance.
Right.
They're trading ahead of what the Fed's going to do. They get the crop report.
But before the crowd just get ready to say the same thing, they got the juice.
Exactly. So the public doesn't understand. They don't understand what you and I understand what Jerome Powell was doing. If you said to a typical consumer, they don't, but they definitely understand what Martin Shkreli and Mallinckrodt and Bausch Health were doing. That's why they came down hard on them, because it has a lot more political capital. And it resonates with the public. The other thing is that it sounds dystopian about this hoarding of assets and hoarding of supplies, especially during the pandemic. And you got state AGs with marshals running around trying to find out how much hand sanitizer you hoarded. It sounds like again, Beyond Thunderdome, Mad Max series Beyond Thunderdome with Tina Turner and Mel Gibson. It seems silly when the movie came out that these people got this gasoline and they have a lot of gasoline and people want to get access to it.
Right.
That's where we're going. It seems like where we're going. And you see a lot of dystopian songs and dystopian movies coming out about resources, who have them and who don't, and how do you get access to them. But I'm going to read an excerpt of the people's explanation of what's going on with the gasoline prices. Right quick. Okay, this is from this is the explanation of the gas prices. How it says here the gas prices soar across the United States, and Biden has asked the Federal Trade Commission to look into whether illegal conduct is driving up the cost of gas prices for families. He knows that illegal conduct is driving up the cost. He knows this. Everybody knows this. So the cost of gasoline is up nearly 50% from a year ago. The latest consumer price index showed as inflation had its largest annual increase in more than 30 years at 6.2%. Blah blah blah. The average price for a gallon of gas is 3.41, $3.41 according to AAA, which is where the average price a year ago was 2.12. So the PCE does not include gasoline prices. Okay, and so it's just important because now this is something called elastic goods. So you have to buy gas to get to work. You cannot avoid these rising prices. I think Biden has asked China to increase their oil reserves to help drive the price down. Right. When you're asking China to increase oil reserves,
as you're beefing with them, mind you.
Right. That's sort of a red flag. And then you have, especially when the U.S. is supposed to be the biggest oil producer or one of the biggest oil producers.
Yep.
What's the point of having our own sustainable energy source if you have to go to China to ask them to increase supply, not to go to our own energy producers? So it shows you that there's price gouging going on with the oil prices, and it can't be avoided. This is a description of a new description of what's going on with the ports, which is separate from the supply. It's another nuance about the supply chain issue. So here goes. This is from The Guardian, and it says, Southern California is dealing with a traffic jam unlike any other. As a record number of container ships have been stuck waiting in the waters outside the port of Los Angeles and Long Beach to unload cargo. It says as of Wednesday, 62 container ships were waiting offshore to unload cargo in Southern California. Let's see. Okay, so with the peak shipping period getting underway as the holiday season approaches, in recent weeks the ports have been setting new records for ships in port almost daily. Traffic has been rising since last summer amid a pandemic-induced buying boom. Let's see. It implies that they what's driving it now is no truckers. They don't have truckers to drive the trucks or whatever. And so
I was reading.
You may have a labor shortage that's causing dislocation in this market. So first it was just supply chain issues. Now you have a labor issue where you don't have enough truckers to drive the trucks to meet the demand. And so that's something different, and there's no telling when that's going to be resolved.
Well,
so it seems like rising prices in some areas, not just this. I wouldn't call this inflation. I would call this a dislocation in certain markets. The same with oil, same with those cold storage machines. That you're going to have rising prices spiraling out of control for a while until you can get truckers back on the job, if at all.
Right. The interestingly enough, I believe it was last week, and I forget which publication that I was reading, but something like 80,000 truckers were taken off the road due to
during the pandemic.
Within the last few months, due to drug test standards.
Oh, okay. You mean vaccines?
No. Like employment drug tests. You know what I mean? You go in. Yeah,
okay, so the opiate crisis has metastasized to the
potential. They didn't necessarily point to any particular drug. The focus of the article was essentially the labor shortage. A little bit of what we are touching on in terms of the national impact about getting goods across the interstate. But the fact that you're taking out such a significant chunk of the labor force certainly adds to the issue that we're talking about regarding the containers and the ability to move those containers. So
that may be the labor shortage could be a little harder to address, I think, in my opinion.
I think it's going to, because even before this previous 4 million that stepped out of the labor force was reported, we've talked about the largest kind of labor revolt that we've seen, certainly in the last maybe half decade, which has been the retail workers. where over 600,000, 700,000 retail workers walked out on the job, strike, and it caused a ripple effect. We saw the Amazon strike. Some of those folks are still striking. They haven't stopped, although the spotlight and the news crews packed up and have left. But those laborers are still at it. Post office as well. We've seen, and most recently, I believe, General Mills labor strike. So we're seeing labor revolts from coast to coast within this country. So it is going to be extremely challenging to measure with any sort of accuracy at this point. We just got the unemployment numbers ticked a little bit higher. I think the expectation was 260 or 263 for unemployment benefits. So although it seems that, the unemployment rate is fairly low, but that is not a useful measurement, simply because,
Right.
as we've already stated several times over, that is really a misnomer in the way that labor is, and specifically unemployment, is counted in this country, because once you are unemployed more than 6 months, you are no longer counted. It's like you cease existing as far as the unemployment numbers. So when we say that, there's about close to 100 million people that are no longer counted in the unemployment numbers, and you're saying, unemployment is at an all-time low, 5.2%. Well, mind you, that does not include the close to 100 million people who are chronically, and it's considered chronic unemployment or chronically unemployed when you're past 6 months, certainly past a year. But in other words, it's a misnomer. It's not an accurate tool. So now that the labor force has been shaken up completely within the last 12 months, I think we just got to toss the whole tool out the window, and it needs to be revamped. It needs to include folks that have quit, have been unemployed for longer than 6 months, even longer than a year. You have to continue to count folks. The only time that folks should not be counted is if they are deceased. It's like they're still walking planet Earth. They should be counted in these numbers in order for us to get a better sense of what is the reality within the economy, what's the reality within the labor force. And even when we talk about matching, is what for the last decade or more, we've heard this mismatch between employers and employable people. We continue to hear this narrative that about reskilling, and there's over 4 million employers that can't find employable people, and these are high paying jobs paying $70, $80, $90,000 a year, and they can't find qualified folks. And, some of that is probably true. I'm willing to bet a small percentage, like less than 10% of that is probably true. I think the greater majority of that is, a lot of it is a misnomer. That that we have this gulf between folks that are have employable skills, but they've been out of the labor market for longer than a year, versus employers who want this catch-22, right? I think we've all been in the labor market long enough to know that when is the best time to get a job? When you already have a job. Why must I need ID in order to get ID? It's kind of that running joke,
Right. to get a girlfriend, you gotta have a girlfriend.
Girlfriend, exactly. It's
And
like,
to get a bad chick, you better have a bad chick.
exactly. Exactly. So
Now,
it's
I don't know
like,
I don't know which one comes first, but yeah.
right.
But also, I think a lot of people hiring these high paying jobs, these tech people, they want foreign workers. They want an
That as
excuse
well. That
bring.
plays a
They
part.
want an excuse to bring people over here. And a lot of tech companies, a lot of them started by foreigners. You look at Google. I think they're foreigners, right? Sergey Brin.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. A lot
I
of the
don't think they're
labor
from this country, but
force.
they want an excuse. The tech jobs, they want an excuse to hire foreigners. I think from a social standpoint, I think Indians and people from Europe probably fit in socially better than African Americans. So when I hear we can't find we can't find employable people for these high paying jobs, what I hear is that we'll come up with any excuse not to hire African Americans because they don't want black folks working those tech jobs. And so you can't tell black folks that when you're helping the tech industry or the tech companies, or you're helping the financial class, the investor class who don't hire black folks, that's good for them or good for the economy. You can explain that to them.
Well, I mean, that
They'll
goes
never get it.
right, right. No,
They,
it's
they,
a,
they,
it's a
they
good
think they
point.
think if nobody's burning a cross, unless somebody's burning a cross in front of the yard or calling them a racial slur, that they're not prejudiced.
Right. No, it's true. It goes to point. I'm not sure if you saw, and I think that this speaks to the spirit of what you're saying. That Biden, or really Biden's administration, was proposing putting together a $400 million package for the immigrants at the border, at the Mexican border. And I think due to the mistreatment of the immigrants by Border Patrol. And while that's well and good, and I don't think anyone is kind of against that approach, right? Well, I'm sure there are people that are against it, but
I bet I can think of some.
right, right. I bet you I can think of a lot
I
of
know
folks
some
too.
YouTubers who can
But,
think about.
but when you have African Americans in this country who have been ignored literally for centuries, who have still not gained reparations, which I'm sure our view accounts get ready to bounce down now.
I beg your pardon?
Which I'm sure the view account, and I'll mention in reparations, like, they about to turn it off now. But at the same time, it goes to their point. It's like you haven't even acknowledged the mistreatment of African Americans in this country and put together you haven't even proposed a federal package. Like, you haven't even gone as far as what you've done for non-citizens, in other words. And that kind of speaks to the spirit. And I have to agree, frankly, that if you are going to propose something for a non-citizen, the least that you can do, as these are tax-paying people, is to offer them a similar treatment. I don't even think you can really argue against that, although I'm sure plenty of people, even people that look like me, and as we say, not all skin folk are kinfolk, but I'm sure that there are some black conservatives that would love to kind of preach against that logic, but at the same time, when you are putting, like when it's just in your face, you can't. You know what I mean? Like, you're almost no choice but
I'm hearing,
to push back against such treatment.
Right.
Yeah.
I know what you're saying. I know what you're saying is very intelligent. What I'm hearing you say, it's probably what you said, but what I'm hearing you say is, the sun should rise in the west. That's what I just heard you say. And so, the reality is that Joe Biden is buying votes. He's trying to buy votes. And he wants immigrant votes. The Democratic Party figured out that black folks finally figured out the gag, that we're not going to do anything for them. They've been voting Democrat for decades, and they finally figured out we're not going to do anything for them. And so, you're seeing hearing African Americans start to talk that Republican talks, and they start to sound like they're about to vote for Republican, or either are voting for Republican, or encouraging people to vote Republican. You hear a lot more African Americans talk, sounding more balanced. I'm not saying they're pushing their politics onto you, but they're
Right.
sounding more balanced and saying, like, well, if the Democratic Party is not going to do anything for us, why are we loyal to the Democratic Party? Even the show here is called Trump and the GE. You know
It's
what I'm saying? So my only point, they're figuring out that African Americans have figured out the gag. So not only are we, their logic is not let's not do something for them to keep them here. Let's find somebody else who can do something to bring them on board. So they're trying to find a way to bring immigrants on into the fold, and if they can bring people, make people citizens who are on the border, or give them 400,000, 150,000 per family who've been separated, who's had children
right.
separated. That could either have them vote Democrat if they come here, or the immigrants are already here to bring more into the Democratic Party.
Right.
That's what
And
he's
this
doing.
is,
Same thing Obama did. Obama tried when he was promoting gay rights and gay marriage. He's getting the LGBT community loyal to him and to vote for him for re-election. And he didn't do anything for African Americans either. As a matter of fact, he distanced himself from black folks. And Biden could say the same thing. Same thing Trump said. What do you have to lose?
well,
What are you going to do for us? What do you have to lose? And
right.
if Obama didn't do anything for you, why should I do anything for you?
And I
That
mean,
could be Biden's
he
response.
specifically said that.
And African Americans never said a word.
Right. He specifically said that, and it's not a new strategy. This, we can go back to the wet foot, dry foot policy. This is this is back in Kennedy's days. So we can see this play out. As some folks old enough to remember that, if all Cubans have to do is hit international waters, and they are given green card status. And this is specifically due to the wet foot, dry foot policy. This is why you see essentially black immigrants are treated very differently. Haitians were coming, and Haitians were primarily coming to seek asylum, but were treated very differently than the Cubans that were literally coming in boats and swimming across the Atlantic to get into the Miami waters. They were handed green cards. Haitians were given bullets and a boot in the butt to go back to Haiti.
Are Haitians black by any chance?
I know, right? Yeah, well, that's why I made the distinction. Like, let's be very clear that while there are a few million Haitians, if the last census is still correct, here they were treated very differently than the Cubans that came here as a result of Castro's policies. And this is primarily why Cubans tend to identify as white. They tend to identify as Republican. They tend to vote very conservatively, both locally as well as federally. So this is not a new strategy to engender certain voting blocks through policy. This is, this has been at play for a very long time, in other words.
Just not for African Americans.
Just not for African Americans. So that's why I want to make that very clear that, while you do have gaps in the economy, even Citibank quantified racism. I think I said it on our last program with Governor-elect Al Bartel that Citigroup quantified the cost of racism over the last century, and quantified it at about $16 trillion. Well, even in our current conversation about inflation, and for those that want to kind of toss up the hands, getting into the race thing. Well, yeah, we are getting into the race thing because guess what? Racism adds to inflation. Like that's essentially the conversation that's being had, that when you discriminate in employment, when you discriminate in housing, when you discriminate in supply chain, when you discriminate in policies that are supposed to impact education and thriving within communities, you discriminate against communities. Guess what? The cost of the goods and services to even service and cater to that smaller demographic. So in other words, we got 400 million people. There's 40 million black folks in this country. If you exclude, you take out 40 million out of the 400, that means, well, we only have 360 million left. Still a pretty large group, right? But now it is going to cost more to service less folks because you've taken a labor force, you've taken contributors, you've taken participants, you've taken folks that can contribute to economic activity, contribute to productivity within this country. You've ostracized them. And you keep doing that across demographics. Is not just black people that are discriminated against, but in other words, when your pool continues to shrink and shrink and shrink, for those that have unfettered access to the economy, unfettered access to education, unfettered access to political policies and the political mechanism, well, that means that the cost of doing business is increased, aka inflation. So even racism costs you your bread, your gas, the roof over your head, the interest rate that you pay on your business loans, on your mortgages, on your personal loans, on your credit cards. It is costing. And that's why Citigroup even quantified that. Think about what $16 trillion would have done within this economy. That would pay the national, just to frame this, that would pay our national interest completely, the national debt completely. We would have zero debt. There would be no Medicaid gap. There would be no Medicare gap. There would be no Social Security gap. So the cost of discriminating against black people has cost us the four most fundamental things. For every dollar that we pay in taxes, the largest, literally 92 cents out of every dollar that we pay in taxes goes to those four things that I just mentioned.
Okay. So the cost
and $16 trillion of racism would have filled that gap, and we would have had surplus. So for those folks that will look at this and want to throw up their hands and, oh, it's a race thing, you damn skippy it is. And we quantify it.
So it's gonna cost us only $16 trillion to keep black folks on the bottom. That's
There
it.
it is.
I thought it was more than that. It's only gonna cost us $16 trillion. I can live. We can live with that. We can live with that. We can live with that. Because black folks got to be on the bottom.
Right.
Black folks has to be on the bottom. Barack Obama interview with the Atlantic.
Yep.
He asked him, why do you lock up bankers? He said, it would have been a violence of the social order. This is the social order he wanted to keep. The so-called first black president wanted to keep intact.
Yep.
Black folks are supposed to be on the bottom. It's a whole thing to keep black folks on the bottom. It's a recession every 8 to 10 years. And all Obama did was make sure that his donors, somebody he wanted to work for when he left office, or somebody he wanted to sleep with, wasn't going to bear the brunt of the next recession.
Yep.
That's all he did. So there's going to be another recession. So I'd like to talk about, sort of pivot a little bit about sort of the vital signs of the economy. And one of the things we look at, even before the pandemic, the economy was slowing. It was stagnant. You saw the, rail traffic slowing. GDP was weak. Industrial production was weak. But the thing about it is consumers kept spending. So the consumer spending is about 2/3 of the economy of GDP, and consumers kept spending. I think now what happens when, I think the pandemic has shown, consumers are commercial. What happens if you have to go a month or 2 months without a paycheck? Can you survive? They probably weren't thinking in those terms before the pandemic. And I think it's showing up in the form of consumer confidence. Retail sales are still ebullient. retail sales grew like 1.7%, I think, last month,
Right.
and they have been strong and expected to be strong through the holiday season. But I'm going to read you something about the consumer confidence. Hold on. There's an article I wrote from Seeking Alpha. So it says uh, consumer spending in the U.S. represents the lion's share of GDP, which implies consumers will likely drive the economy post-pandemic. The University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Gauge was 71.4 in October, down from 72.8 in September. This was the second lowest since 2011, and it sounds foreboding for consumer spending going forward. So, consumer confidence has presaged a recession, right? A fall in consumer confidence presaged
Right.
the prior recession, and it's a good predictor of a slowing economy or economy that's about to head into recession. So, what you could have is, once all the noise, because you still have all these, it's kind of hard to really predict accurately because you have all this noise, you have all this supply chain issues, quantitative easing, market dislocations. Now you have infrastructure spending, so it's kind of hard to really get a bead on what's the economy's real capacity, what's this real growth, because you have all this quantitative easing and all this noise. But I think the stark reality is that you could have stagflation for a while, where you have an economy that turns down because consumers pull back on spending and costs spiraling out of control for certain things like gasoline, or other items that continue to spike until we get these supply chain issues under control. So you could have stagflation, rising unemployment, slowing economy, and spiking prices for certain things. I think that's where we hit it.
Yeah, I mean, I think typically around this time too, and this is where we typically see sentiment start to get some kind of corporate media attention when it comes to Christmas spending, right? So for a lot of retailers, this will be the bulk of their annual sales is during this time period, so after Thanksgiving through January. And typically that sentiment is often felt as well. Obviously, it's kind of a no-brainer that, during the pandemic, we wouldn't expect the same lines hanging out of stores and even Cyber Monday largely kind of went flat a bit compared to previous years. So it not only kind of becomes that prequel, right, before the storm of just during that time period, but for the remainder of the year, really. And the difference is that the policy, because sentiment is one thing, right? It's just kind of how do we feel about the economy, right? Like how do we feel about our household finances, income? Do we have jobs? Do we not have jobs? Can we afford, our rent, mortgage, kids, daycare, education, and kind of the list of things. That's really what economic sentiment represents, right? Is how do I feel, confident do I feel about that to be able to go out and spend, especially beyond just the necessities, to be able to have discretionary spending, meaning I've paid all my bills and I still have a couple bucks left over, and I just want to splurge a bit with the money that's left over. But beyond that, the difference is that the sentiment is matching the policies, though. And I think that's the unique thing is that, again, for the last 12 years, we've had a monetary policy that was only supposed to last for a few years. It's
Right.
lasted for
Exactly.
12. And now, you have created a weaker economy. The patient has checked into the hospital and gotten sicker since being in the hospital. what healthcare workers call nosocomial infections, right? Where it's an infection after you get admitted into the hospital for whatever you got admitted into the hospital for. Well, now we've just added to your added to your problems. That's what the Federal Reserve has done to the economy. So not only did we have the original problem before checking into the hospital, we now have this additional problem after checking into the hospital. And now now it's like the doctor realizes, oh, you have a nosocomial infection? No problem. I quit. And then all the nurses quit. And then the hospital shuts down. And now you're just left there sitting on the pavement with no healthcare workers, no help. And they're telling you, oh, no, you can do it. Just stand up and, take some vitamin C. You'll be good. Just take a couple vitamins. You'll be all right. Right. That's kind of what's happening here. So in other words, the economy has been left weaker. And so, of course, the sentiment is feel like giving that example. If a surveyor came up to you after the doctor and the nurses say they quit after worsening your original condition, and the survey, well, how do you feel? What is your confidence level that you'll get better? Like, that's really what, that kind of represents, right? It's like, well, my confidence is, at a -2. It's like, that's what I mean, that the difference is that the policy kind of matches the sentiment. It's not just a psychological thing. Sentiment kind of represents the household psychology in a way, right?
Right.
It's not just in your head, in other words.
Right.
Like, this is very real inflation thing. It doesn't feel like things are getting more expensive. Sometimes we can kind of get a suspicion like, man, did that go up a couple cents? Like, I remember it used to be this price, but now it's this price. But, it's kind of vague, right? It's kind of pulling at straws. You're like, I don't know. Maybe it's just me. And it's like, nope, it's not just you. It's not in your head. It's not psychological. This is a very real inflation. Prices are going up in a very real way. Wages, although wages numerically have increased about 6% over the last decade, when you look at real inflation, meaning the actual price that things have been increasing, wages have essentially deflated. We've had negative growth with wages. If your wage goes up by $2, but your cost of living goes up by $200, well, you've had a negative wage growth. But I can technically say, well, your wages actually increased. Like, well, yes, it did, but the purchasing power of my wages actually decreased, and that's the situation that we're looking at.
The corporate media, and when Jerome Powell and the corporate media, when he described it seemed like they're talking about something that's so amorphous that they have no idea what.
Right.
Like, it's like in the Mad Max theme. The motif is like the people who own gasoline and trying to describe how people live who don't have access to gas. The people outside that they built that little city for themselves.
Right.
How the people outside the city live, they really don't know unless somebody who came from outside the city tell them this is how they living over there. Y'all should be happy. You know what I'm saying?
Exactly, and that's why I
think
like
Jerome Powell and yelling these people can really accurately describe what the public's going through because they aren't experienced because they're picking out on stock market gains, you know what I mean?
Right. And when the majority of your cohort and peers and friend group is in the 5%, the 1% of the nation, you're going to have a very skewed view, even if you come from humble beginnings. That's the thing, that when you have lived longer in a significantly higher economic class than you started off, even if you started off in poverty, and while you may never forget those memories, but you will forget the everyday struggles that those lower classes experience. So that's why I like to bring things back to a kind of down to earth explanation. Because when you listen to Janet Yellen, and when you listen to Jerome Powell and all the Bible talking heads on corporate media, and they're talking from this high perch and this 30,000 viewpoint, and you're getting explained to by someone who literally makes $6 million a year, $2 million a year, in order to have that seat. You're not speaking the same language. You're not speaking from a point that is going to connect with how do we bring this down to a very practical sense. How can folks, in other words, be educated through this platform? Because again, to me, the Occupy Wall Street, if there was I guess, real sense of understanding, I don't think that would have ever relented. Like, Occupy Wall Street would still be happening right now, because the whole point to Occupy Wall Street, as it was essentially explained in the beginning when they started, although there were varying reasons and different groups that essentially formed a coalition of organizers and was there for varying forms of economic justice. But the point remains that it was all started by what was felt, bankers' greed, Wall Street greed. Mm-hmm. That didn't stop. Like, when did that stop? That didn't stop. The Federal Reserve has fueled that, which has been our point. Right. So in other words, Occupy Wall Street, like, people should still be in the streets, and it, like, to me, with even more vitriol. You know what I mean? Like,
right. But the corporate media, they kept spinning their own narrative, and people on CNBC were wondering, what's the problem? Why are they protesting? It's almost like I'm waiting for. They're like, what's wrong?
Confused.
What's wrong? What's wrong with bailing out? Shouldn't you? Because they're talking their own book. You bail out Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, and you spike the stock market. More people was tuning in CNBC.
Right, exactly.
So I'm waiting for that. I'm waiting for that Marie Antoinette moment where someone says, the equivalent, let them eat cake.
Right.
And someone said, well, why don't just buy Moderna? Why didn't you buy Moderna? You know what I'm saying? It's like it's just a disconnect. And that Occupy Wall Street is a good example that people on CNBC was wondering, what's wrong with them?
Right.
Why don't they just go get a job? Why don't they go work at CNBC or MSNBC or, you know what I'm saying? Like, right. you are basically supported by the government.
Right.
And when during the financial crisis, they knew what the problem was. They all had sad faces.
Exactly.
And all of a sudden, somebody spikes the stock market, and it's great because it's good for them, personally. And so I'm waiting for that.
You could have bought Bitcoin when it was, back in 2012, man.
Right. It's got right.
That's your fault.
And so all they did was, all the government did was, they had the police go out there and harass those people. You know what I'm saying? And harass those people. And Occupy Wall Street didn't get funding from corporations like Black Lives Matter or some other entities.
Yep.
But you're right. That is basically, if they had let that get out of the way and try to find out what's going on with these people and not make them out to be goofballs. They were laughing at them. CNBC was laughing at them and trying to make fun of them. Like, it's basically a mirror that how the country really is, and that their way of I guess the populist way of saying that you bailing out these banks for what?
Right.
What's it got to do with the economy? They didn't say it the way we would say it, but they said it.
Yeah.
And CNBC was dumbfounded.
Was completely confused as to why these people are out here. And it was mind blowing. It was absolutely mind blowing. Right.
Okay, so last parting shot. To come up on the
Yeah, I mean, as I've stated before, unfortunately, I think, well, what's the solution to it all? I think maybe in a future episode, maybe we'll delve a little bit into the infrastructure bill. As I've said before in previous episodes, that that we have to see New Deal type policies to take us off of this crash course that the country is on right now. The infrastructure bill represents a glimpse of that, but it cannot be all of that. It can't be all of that. I think the infrastructure bill originally supposed to be 3.7 is cut to essentially half that, like 1.4 trillion dollars, with a lot of that, a few hundred billion going into infrastructure and roads, which is desperately needed, which should bring jobs, etc. However, again, that has to be the first step, but not the only step, nor the last step. So solution, in other words, that is the solution, is that at this point, it is such dire, this country is stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Like, that is where we're at as a country socially. That is where we're at politically. That is where we're at economically. Let me be very clear. That is how almost inviolable things are. So the solution cannot be just singularly focused in its approach. It has to be a very wide solution, much like the New Deal. It has to address many facets, not just the stock market, not just crypto, not just blockchain technology. It has to get into the poorest of the poor. It has to get into even the upper middle class. It has to get into the reaches of education. It has to get into the reaches of the labor market. It has to get into the reaches of manufacturing. It has to get into agriculture. It literally has to impact every sector that runs this country and that folks need in order to live day to day. That is how terrible things are. So we are beyond, in other words, solutions that a household can handle. While some households will be able to handle this, inflation better than others, but even making a couple $100,000 a year at the current rate of inflation is not enough. It's not enough. Like, whatever you're making, even if you're making 250, 400, $500,000, you need to triple that in order to afford the course that we are on, in other words. So what is that solution? Other than, I guess tearing it all down and starting over, as the anarchists would say, it has to be a greater demand of accountability politically, but not just politically, also kind of these apolitical institutions like the Federal Reserve that is responsible for much of our fiscal policy. So there has to be greater demand. There has to be greater pressure that's coming from the people. Much like what we saw with BLM, where it transcended race and class. It was really a coalition of all races across all classes. So clearly we see that it can be done. We have a very recent example that when the issues stink high enough that people are willing to overlook the race and class differences to collectively organize themselves and make demands of the government, well, we have reached a point where that needs to happen in order to take this country off its crash course that is currently on. Otherwise, if Jerome Powell ever listens to this, get your head out your ass. you have uh, created, you have contributed. You know, although you took over for Janet Yellen, who needs to get her head out of her ass because she can't play both sides of the fence. You helped create this situation. And now that you're over at the Treasury, now you're pretending to have accountability and that, oh, you weren't the biggest contributor to this very situation that we are looking at. And Jerome Powell now is sitting in that position. And pretty much you guys need to go back to the quantitative easing and put together common sense policy, common sense approaches. Stop going to BlackRock. Stop going to your hedge fund friends and putting billions of dollars in their pockets. Start putting it into the taxpayers' pockets so that the liquidity can flow through the real economy, not just the investor class economy. That would be the solution.
Well, you could have made this the same speech back in 2008 and it would have been just as accurate.
Yeah, pretty much.
You could have said the exact same thing. It would have been just as accurate. So it's just been a bunch of nonsense over the past decade or so. All this money printing and so on and so forth. But the media is going to bail out Jerome Powell and Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen. Talk about what a great job Janet Yellen did and Jerome Powell did. And as far as Ben Bernanke is concerned, he may not say the global economy, but he's doing everything he can. So
Right.
the media is going to control the narrative and how they are viewed throughout history. As far as policy is concerned, I don't know. There is no policy really, because Biden never ran on any policy. It was just Trump.
None.
We're gonna bring the people back together. I'm gonna reach across the aisle. I'm the anti-Trump. That's it. Didn't really run on any policies.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure what policies you could expect from him. He's gonna try to find a way to get reelected through messaging, and which is what sort of what Van Jones suggested after the decimation of Virginia by the Democratic Party, that the Democrats have to have a new message or improve their messaging, not actually do anything, but just improve the messaging.
Right.
That they stop coming across as annoying
Right.
and contentious, and don't be so annoying.
Right.
And
Exactly.
don't be so triggering to people.
Be more like
Come up
Obama.
with a new come up with a new messaging, even though you're not gonna
Do
do anything.
anything.
Right. Just come up with a new message. But
Right.
so it's going to be very interesting. Again, I think we're going to see more inflation. I think people starting to question. Um, were they better under Trump? They're asking for Trump to come back now. A lot of people they don't like high gas prices. That's for sure. They don't like high grocery prices.
Yep.
They don't see any leadership coming from the White House. This is the very thing they're complaining about Trump. Are sort of Biden's sort of his weaknesses is that he doesn't really communicate with the public. You very very rarely see them. People are upset about Trump because he's always tweeting and communicating all the time. Biden
Right.
doesn't communicate at all. You know what Trump's doing on all the issues. You know his policy. Well, nobody knows what Biden's policies are or where he stands on anything. That things we complain about as far as this weak response to this opiate litigation that never ends. We don't know who to go to.
No.
The state AGs are on board with these lawsuits that aren't necessarily about legal precedents. Who do you turn to? If you can't reach out to Joe Biden or Merrick Garland, I think they'll listen to us.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? So
Yeah.
that's the Trump was such a polarizing person, and he was always making decisions. Biden makes no decisions. You know what I'm saying? So people complain about decisions Trump was making. He was making decisions. He took a stand on things. So it's almost like the guy who takes the shot at the end of the game, and he missed it. Well, he missed the shot, but he took it though. He didn't go.
Right.
He didn't hide. And so there's certain things that they said they hated about Trump, they kind of missed that now. And that Biden doesn't really have any
It's
policies.
certainly interesting.
I'm gonna reach across the aisle. I'm gonna bring the country back together again. I'm gonna repair the country as if it was actually torn apart previously. I'm gonna bring the country back together again. I'm gonna We need to resist Trump. And so, as far as African Americans are concerned, where the Biden administration talks about resisting Trump, for black folks, he's going to give people on the border, hundreds of millions of dollars to vote for him. But with black folks, it's something symbolic. So, but anyway, it seems like the fix is in. There's going to be more inflation and a declining in consumer confidence. As people, I think they saw a commercial during the pandemic what life would be like if they missed a few paychecks. And
Right.
I see that the economy the week before the pandemic is not going to get any better. The fact that we keep adding stimulus on top of stimulus on top of stimulus to spur the economy after a decade of stimulus show you how weak the economy really is. Now, a lot of it's not Biden's fault, but he was the vice president during the Obama years.
He
So
was.
he can't be. So he can't say he didn't have any part of this policy. But anyway, so
Exactly.
that's Trump and the G. That's Trump and the GE. As we try to fight inflation. From Torian Mitchell and myself. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Thank you.
All right.